The Second World War scarred the world with death and destruction. Yet, out of those dark days, there grew a friendship that has transcended time. Canada and the Netherlands have a bond that few countries have ever enjoyed. The Dutch suffered greatly as an occupied nation, and Canada came to their aid.
Bevrijding, that's liberation. Vrijheid is freedom. Freedom. I think you can only know what is freedom when you had a time you didn't have freedom.
There's a great love between Dutch people and Canadians.
That's something so unique, special. Love, it's a love affair.
And it's because the Canadian soldiers gave back after 5 years of occupation our liberty, our freedom.
We, the Dutch, will never forget what the Canadian soldiers did and the Allies did for us.
The Netherlands had been neutral in World War I and planned to do the same as Europe teetered towards war in 1939. Their willingness to provide refuge to oppressed groups made the country a primary destination for Jews escaping Nazi persecution. Hitler's guarantee of Dutch neutrality in 1939 eased many minds. Less than a year later, that promise would be broken as the Nazis invaded the Netherlands.
On May the 10th, we woke up and my father was putting paper strips on the windows to try and keep them from shattering as the planes were droning overhead.
My father and I were standing outside in the garden and we heard pang, pang, pang above our heads. And that was an air fight. And I remember my father saying, "That's the end of us." You know, up till then, because we had been neutral in the First World War. And we were Jewish. I'm Jewish.
German paratroopers landed around my former hometown of The Hague. Their intention was to capture the government and the Queen.
The royal family left for England. There was Queen Wilhelmina, Princess Juliana, Prince Bernhard, and their 2 children at the time. And very soon, Juliana apparently it wasn't safe for her to stay in England, they figured. So she left, I think, by ship to Canada with the 2 princesses. And the 3rd daughter, Margriet, was born here. And in 43, I believe. And Margriet, when she was born, they declared that part of the hospital as Dutch territory so that she would be a Dutch citizen.
Holland never counted on that the Germans would invade Holland. The government didn't, and the people didn't expect it. Didn't happen in World War I, and they never thought it was going to happen in World War II.
The Dutch army was ill-equipped, very small.
Well, I was in Rotterdam at that time. I was a nurse in the hospital, a Koolsingel hospital, and we had already lots of wounded people, wounded soldiers in. But I said, well, we are safe here for the Red Cross on the roof. And lo and behold, the hospital was bombed.
Rotterdam got bombed. That was the end of the war. Because the German threat was there. If you don't surrender, completely surrender, we're going to do the same thing to other cities.
The invasion that was to take only 1 day lasted 5. Brave Dutch resistance ended in the face of overwhelming odds. The casualties were devastating, and a stunned Dutch populace faced occupation.
In the beginning, it was hardly noticeable, except that there were some Germans.
In the beginning of the war, they tried to bribe us, more or less, you know. Tried to be friendly and all that, trying to talk us into it, that it was a good thing.
They treated us with whatever we wanted. Candies, food, whatever. And that lasted for a while, and then it changed.
The Germans handled the occupation of Holland differently than all of the other nations that they invaded. They installed a civilian government instead of the usual military command. They kept the Dutch bureaucrats and laws. Seyss-Inquart was named Reichscommissioner, and subtly Nazi control seeped into the everyday lives of the Dutch.
The announcements, how to behave and all that, to get your citizen card. And gradually they started to enforce their ruling.
In November, they asked all personnel of government institutions and municipal institutions, universities, schools, to sign a declaration of Aryan blood. And if you weren't an Aryan, it meant you were a Jew. And then slowly after that, they fired all the Jews.
I became very conscious of the war as a Jew in 1942. There was a decree by the Nazis, the occupying forces, I should say, on May the 1st, that all Jews from age 6 on had to wear a Star of David.
I had two very, very close friends. We grew up together. We did everything together. And all of a sudden, and they were Jewish, and all of a sudden they had to wear a star on their clothing, and I didn't. And I was allowed to go to the beach, but they weren't. And it was time to start school, and they were not allowed to go to the school I was supposed to go to.
And that was for my family, we weren't Jewish, really the major problem of the war. The persecutions of the Jews.
We were used to having the Jews around, and we always have been very hospitable having the Jews there, so we couldn't understand this.
The Jews are very assimilated, so the people who weren't that interested didn't even know that there was so a big problem, I think.
The other thing that was very noticeable is that my mother had to close her business, because that was also a decree by the occupiers that no Jews could have a business.
They established a ghetto in the city of Amsterdam, barbed wire around several blocks of city houses.
Slowly, people living outside Amsterdam were sent to Amsterdam. That was more
the Jews.
The Jews. That
Yeah.
was convenient, of course, for the
And
Germans.
You could feel something was terribly wrong.
In 1942 is when they started rounding up the Jews, and I believe that's when the resistance became more prominent than before. There was a lot of resentment on what they were doing to the Jews.
The Nazis made one decree after another, limiting the rights and movements of Jews in the Netherlands. For the Jews, it was a matter of survival, and clashes occurred that led to the general strike of February 25, 1941. It would be the only public protest against the Nazi treatment of Jews in all of occupied Europe.
The Jews resisted. And during one of the fights, one of the Dutch Nazi people was killed. And then, as a reprisal, the Germans raided and arrested Jewish men. They're all in the center of Amsterdam, and they were sent to a concentration camp, and nobody survived of those. And when that happened, the Dutch population, non-Jewish population, went on strike.
And how long did that?
A couple of days. Then the measures against the strike were very harsh.
Very quickly the whole thing went completely out of control.
But then gradually they started taking the newspapers, taking the radio, then there was no communication, everything was in Hitler's hands. So they could more or less brainwash us and make us believe that everything was fine.
And they confiscated everything.
If you were caught with a bicycle on the street and the Germans came along, that would be gone. They would just take it. Anything was taken. Anything of value was taken by the Germans and shipped to Germany.
Then there was hardly any provisions anymore. You got coupons for food and all that, but by the time you got there, it was not there anymore.
Anything that had a bit of rubber on it, you used it to put underneath your shoes. Our shoes were cut open at the top, the front, and the back, so to allow for growth of the shoes, because we couldn't get new shoes.
You were not allowed to have any radios. I think my dad had one hidden.
And neighbors would come also and listen to the radio that we had. It was hidden. No, it was dangerous to have a. You were not supposed to have a radio at all. They all had to be handed in.
The winter of 42, my father had pneumonia and he was in a hospital, and he didn't come home anymore. He was picked up by the Germans for interrogation and subsequently shipped off to a camp, a Dutch concentration camp called Vught, near 's-Hertogenbosch, as a political prisoner because he was betrayed. He did some underground work.
The concentration camp at Vught was used primarily for Dutch political prisoners, although it was used for Jewish prisoners as well. The camp was notorious for the viciousness of its guards and diabolical tortures that claimed many thousands of lives. In the meantime, the Nazis were rounding up Jews throughout the Netherlands and began shipping them to extermination camps in Poland and Germany. For many Jews, there was only one hope: to go into hiding. 24,000 were hidden by Dutch Gentiles at great personal risk. The dangers they faced have been immortalized by the diary of Anne Frank.
And all of a sudden, one of my little friends, Florence, she disappeared. And that disappearing was really called going in hiding.
Every day you would come to school, there would be some kids missing.
I was in the same school as Anne Frank, and every day there were fewer children. Either the families had been caught in raids, or they went underground, as in Anne Frank's case, or in my case, or a few families committed suicide, the whole family.
And we went on the streetcar when we were still allowed to, and after about 2 stops, the SS was there, or the Gestapo, whatever, and they hauled all the Jews off the streetcar. I crawled around the streetcar and I went back home, and I just said, Mom is gone, I don't know where. From that point on, everything went downhill.
One day my father came home and said, we've been denounced, and that night we stayed as a family, the 4 of us. My older sister was already gone, in a friend's house, but he couldn't keep us. And the next morning we were on our way to our different addresses. My parents to one, and my sister to one, and I to another one. So that was the end of the family.
There was a certain cautiousness. There was a lot of people did not commit themselves to take in German people, because if you, well, as we know, if you were found to hide Jewish people, you were sent off to concentration camps along with them.
And then lots of the Jewish people, they went into hiding with the Catholics, the Protestants, and so on.
This came down from the pulpits in the churches, mainly in the north of Holland. The Protestants, more than the Roman Catholics, said, start something, let's help the kids.
My parents had a Jewish family couple, and they had a baby.
Then the grown-ups were put in the theater in Amsterdam, in the heart of Amsterdam, and the children were taken across the street to a Jewish daycare center. We were held there, and it was full. There were 232 kids in there. Eventually they would be transported to the camp in Holland, which is Westerbork.
Westerbork was a transit camp where Jews were gathered for transportation east. There were weekly trains to Auschwitz, as well as to Sobibor, Theresienstadt, and Bergen-Belsen. Today, it's a museum that commemorates the lives of those who passed through the camp en route to their deaths. Over 100,000 made the trip. never to return.
And we were saved by one of the larger underground groups. It's called the NV group. And they took all of us, not at the same time, but by bunches, out of the daycare center and said, come on, I will take you to your hiding place on the back of a bicycle. You are no longer Jewish. You're going to a family that's Christian Reformed. You got to go to church if you are allowed out in the street. You have to do as if you're one of them. You became a liar at the age of 6 and 7. You learned to lie, to save yourself and to save your rescuers.
In our case, there were close calls.
How many?
3, actually. The first was on the 5th of December, and I remember that because it was St. Nicholas Eve. And they were banging on the door, and the Germans came and they said, we want your cigars, and if you don't give them, we'll take you, the Jewish child you have.
Fear gripped those who hid Jews and those who were in hiding.
They took everything off the bed, put a piece of wood underneath, and put me with a sort of a blanket and put me there, and the spring, and another piece of wood, and then the double mattresses, and they made up the bed perfectly. So that was my going to bed when it was dangerous. 2 Nazis did show up in the house, and they ran through it, and they came upstairs. They looked at the one bed, her little sister, looked, and then they looked at my bed, took a bayonet, stabbed it through it. It didn't hit me, because I was between the wood.
Most families that went into hiding were split up and did not see each other for several years. For some, loved ones were caught, never to be seen again.
But after a few weeks, they were sent to the transition camp, the Westerbork in the north.
And there they met relatives.
Other family was there. They always met up. But my parents were the first to be sent to Theresienstadt because they had an S on their papers, which is straf, punishment, because they had been found in hiding while the others had gone or were by raids or whatever. My parents of that family were really the only ones not to survive.
A lot of us were hidden, and a lot of us were betrayed, but a lot of us survived, thanks to these people. They were amazing, plain, nice people, not rich, not poor. Became one of the family. I'll always be grateful.
But you couldn't trust anybody.
But you couldn't trust anybody.
I mean, neither the Germans nor the Dutch.
So there was much animosity, and of course then right away they started and built the underground.
There was the LO, I'll spare you the Dutch word. They looked after the people that were in hiding. Onderduikers, they call them, divers. They also looked after getting them ration cards. The ration cards came from the fighting resistance. 2 different elements altogether. My brother was in the fighting resistance, it was LOLKP, the knokploegen. It's a Dutch word, it means the fighting units. They were armed. And they would do railways, bridges, German installations, and the places where the ration cards were issued. They would take raids on them and rob the cards and then pass them on to us, to the non-fighting groups. I belong to the non-fighting groups.
Well, my brother was then in the resistance too, and my sister was in it too, my elder sister. They did all sorts of things. They would go to the jail and try to free some of the people which have been picked up by the Germans.
The underground itself worked in cells, and lots of times the people in the cells didn't know the other group. There was one person maybe that is a contact, but never by name.
They printed newspapers. So, and that was of course dangerous if you brought them around.
The Dutch underground had one enormous drawback. That was the geographical situation in Holland, where everything is flat. You can't
very visible.
And where you are so visible.
We had a radio connection with England, with the Dutch government in exile in London. Radio Orange, they call that, Radio Oranje. And anyway, one of the guys was arrested He was tortured and he broke. And that next day, 17 people in my mother's group were arrested, including my mom. I disappeared because they were looking for me too. I was 17 at the time. My brother then went and worked at the dropping fields near Spanbroek in north of Amsterdam. I joined him. Then the containers were dropped. The planes would come in at about 300-400 meters. They came in sort of flying very low, Lancasters, Halifaxes. Containers would come down. We would detach the parachutes. Now, this is a story that most people find hard to believe. The contents of the containers were put in German army trucks. The German army trucks were driven by Dutch resistance fighters in German uniforms. And that's how all the supplies got across Holland from north to south, from east to west.
When they heard about the Jews being lined up and brought to a certain camp, then they bombed the railroad, sabotaged everything that the Germans did. And of course then it came the revenge from the Germans.
The reprisals were terrible. Not just in Holland. For one German, many resistance people would die. And hostages too, but not just prisoners, not just resistance prisoners, but hostage doctors, lawyers, prominent people that were just put behind bars to serve as hostages when the time would come, and they would be taken out of jail and lined up and shot.
All of a sudden, somebody disappeared. Right? And it could have been shot, it could be in the concentration camp. We didn't know at that particular time.
All this stuff created more resentment and more hatred amongst the Dutch.
The universities were closed completely in 1943 when the Germans asked from the students and the staff a declaration of loyalty, as it was called.
They had to sign.
They had to sign, and the students, with few exceptions, refused.
That was what they called the Arbeidsdienst, a German word, where any young man, 18 years and up, would have to report for labor.
They were picking up men just off the street, and I can remember coming back from school one time, and we saw this German truck, and they were just picking any able-bodied men off the street, and they were being transported to Germany. So we ran home, told my dad, and my dad had a little shack at the back. They built a little loft on there, and him and his neighbor, they hid up there for 3 weeks.
So my brother was shipped off to Germany, and he knew how to escape.
The stress were on the parents, because they never know if I would leave the house, they never know if you come back.
The situation seemed hopeless, but that soon changed. The Allies invaded Normandy, and they fought their way north to the Dutch frontier. On September 17, 1944, Operation Market Garden was launched. British and American paratroopers dropped deep into the Netherlands in an attempt to end the war by Christmas.
And one day we looked out, and here came, all these planes came over, and I don't know how many parachutes came down, and the Germans were standing there ready with their guns and shot them out of the air, and people started crying and praying out loud for nobody was going to survive from that. That was terrible.
I was just north enough not to be liberated in September 44. My sister and brother were. They were in the extreme south.
Montgomery's daring plan failed to reach a bridge too far. For many Dutch in the south, liberation had finally come. But it was obvious that the war was far from over. The Canadian Army began its historic role in the Netherlands in October 1944 with the Battle of the Scheldt.
The point and purpose of the Battle of the Scheldt was to open the Scheldt estuary so that they could use the port of Antwerp.
It's become a very essential strategic operation because the supply lines are still coming in from Normandy, and it was stretching the limits to keep the whole Allied front supplied with ammunition and food and so on.
It was the coldest winter in 40 years in all of Europe, but it didn't make the going any easier.
The plan was for the Canadian 2nd Division to clear the north shore of the Scheldt estuary, while the 3rd Division would be responsible for the south shore. The 4th Armored Division would provide support. For the 3rd Division, the first mission was to cross the Leopold Canal.
We went up to the Leopold Canal, and we knew they told us that the German troops on the other side of the canal. They set up an attack to go, and our mortars were involved. Although the first assault was mainly the Canadian Scottish Reginas. There's a small bridgehead for the first few days, and the company was over Canadian Scottish company was overrun, and one of our companies went in and put a counterattack and relieved them and regained the ground. They had a lot of good artillery, a lot of support, a lot of fire support, and we couldn't get our air support in there because it was always cloudy and rainy, and no way of getting it in.
The original attack had been across Leopold from the south, and they were having so much trouble and so many deaths.
And the tank corps and the artillery was right up to the edge of the Leopold Canal, but couldn't get across.
So they decided that we'd try and speed things up and do the attack from the north.
On buffaloes, and come in from the sea.
And the operation was called Switchback.
Our brigade, the 9th Brigade, landed on a tributary of the Scheldt estuary.
It was quite dark, and when we loaded up, and we waited a while until after dark, and then we started to move out.
And when they get into the water, they're only about 8 inches showing above the water. And we were quite afraid that if a wave came, we were going to be swimming.
We landed around just after 2 o'clock in the morning.
The heavy guns from Breskens, the coastal guns, hadn't wakened up to the fact of what was happening.
It was tough going there, getting off, because it was the tide was sort of down, and the beaches were large and wet, and you sank into it. Your boots sank into it. Everything sank into it.
Anyway, we got in the first dike, and in fact, there's a marker there now in commemoration of that. And we got to the next dike, and of course, then they had all their defenses set up.
It wasn't until later in the morning that we started to get some serious fire.
We were under quite a bit of mortar fire and shell fire. The only good thing about that was the land was so wet and damp that the shells went way down before they exploded, and all you got was mud and crap all over the place.
Yeah, they certainly laid down a lot of shelling, and we started to get casualties.
Now think about our support was coming from in front of us, because they were back at the Leopold Canal. So if you call for artillery or mortar, it was coming towards you.
Then the 9th Brigade, they were on our right, I believe. We took the left, and we were in through Bière-Valette.
The Germans did flood the areas with salt water, which damaged the land, I'm sure, for some years to come.
The rifle companies had the worst part of it, because they were had to use the dikes to keep out of the water, and they were just subjected to silhouettes against the skyline.
And often along the dikes, and especially at the junction of the dikes, they had dug holes, machine gun holes and so on for coverage, and so they could fire even along the sides of the dikes, which were maybe 10, 12 feet high at an angle.
I would call in artillery and use one gun to snipe machine gun posts along the dike.
There were trees along usually the top of the dike, and usually either a path or a roadway between the trees. And so you had to try and dodge from tree to tree.
Going out the Scheldt was
not as easy as it seems. There were times that we would go in on a patrol, and you were up to your waist, anywhere from your ankles to your waist in water to get across those boulders.
That's where we got our name, the water rats, conversely to the desert rats of the English division in Africa.
You'd come back soaking wet, and there were times when your clothes literally dried on you.
And the trouble is, if you did have armor, it's got to ride on top of the dikes. Well, you know, if you got a dike sitting about 30 feet in the air, and now you've got a tank riding along the top of it, like shooting ducks sort of thing, you know.
Now, of course, the artillery was our main support, and but the Typhoon bombers, at times when we were able to get them, and the conditions are right, did a fantastic job.
The Canadians faced miserable conditions during the month of fighting in the Breskens Pocket. Combat was vicious, as Hitler had ordered that the estuary be held at all costs.
Oh, they were surrounded because they couldn't go across the water because they're going into an area that's already being attacked, and they can't go anywhere else the other way. They can't go back to Belgium, it's already cleared. All that part of Holland up to Nijmegen's cleared. They were just in a pocket. But, you know, damn, they're not going to give up.
When we got in our position in Beervliet, after a lot of heavy enemy shelling and so on, I went around to check my company position in the night, middle of the night, and I found I didn't have any officers left.
We had some 19 or so killed in the next couple of days around there, and they were buried. You couldn't bury them in the polder because it was too wet. You go down 6 inches and you're in the water. So they had to bury them on the side of the dike.
There was quite a problem in keeping up our reinforcements. They were very slow coming, and the ones that did come had little or no infantry training. So it was quite stressful in that respect.
And I was keeping a low profile, down low, and all of a sudden there was a shot, and I just threw myself down. I started looking and see, then I saw there was blood running down my battle dress, and my hand was hurting all of a sudden. So I took stock, and I found that a bullet had gone through my left hand and creased my right leg. So they sent me home on what they call a tri-wound scheme. You've been wounded 3 times, they said you're out.
But anyway, we progressed, and eventually, well, as I said, by the end of, I guess the 3rd or 4th November, it was pretty well over, and the last place to take out was Connaught and Heist.
Well, our men got right in, and then as soon as they saw they were surrounded, they just gave up. The white flags came up in white sheets, and I think there was something like 1,100 came out of that position.
The biggest battle for the Scheldt was on the island of Walcheren, and that was left up to the 2nd Div to do that.
For the Canadian 2nd Division, the Battle of the Scheldt required the clearing of the north shore of the estuary. The first stage required clearing the isthmus that connected South Beveland to the mainland.
There were 3 principal towns, Woensdrecht, Hoogerheide, and Ossendrecht. And there were like a triangle, and there was some vicious fighting went on there.
The key strategic point was the town of Woensdrecht, which had a hill that overlooked the entire isthmus. In order to advance into South Beveland, Woensdrecht had to be taken. That task was given to the Black Watch.
What's referred to as Black Friday. Friday the 13th of October, we were to make an attack on a dike that was actually part of a railroad embankment, and it was where it was crossed by a roadway on the bend. It was called Operation Angus, but it was a fluid situation because they had the protection of this great high embankment, and they could move around on the far side. For some reason, there was a delay, and the attack never went in until 6:30 in the morning instead of 5:30, and which brought on considerably more light. And trying to make our way across the flats, and it was tragic. The flats were wide open. There wasn't a decent blade of grass to hide behind, and we suffered an awful lot of casualties there. And consequently, it didn't fail, but it didn't succeed too well.
The Black Watch had been decimated with an incredible number of casualties. The battle continued for Woensdrecht, and the Canadians overcame the German positions.
I think it was the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry. They made an attack, and it was organized through other brigade regiments. And I believe the Typhoons come in and rocketed the positions, and that we overcome that position, and the Germans withdrew and went north toward Bergen-op-Zoom. And with that movement, we moved onto the neck of the peninsula, out onto toward the town of Goos.
The 2nd Division pushed across South Beveland into the capital city of Goos. The Germans were committed to a fighting retreat, backing into their final holdout, Walcheren Island. At the same time, other elements of the Canadian Army fought towards Bergen-op-Zoom to the north.
The condition of the people, we wouldn't believe. Even today, it can bring me to tears. Bad enough to watch the adults, but to see starving children is something else. So one of these guys took his mess tin and he started feeding one of them. Somebody else on the other side, he took his mess tin. Before you know it, there's a dozen kids around there. And our guys stopped eating, we were feeding the kids. We got the order to move on. We got a hold of a civilian that seemed to be in some kind of authority. And whatever food we had in the vehicle, we had surplus food. We left it at the side of the road. And his first thought was, we can't pay you. We're not selling.
The 2nd Division cleared South Beveland and moved on to face the last major German stronghold on the Scheldt, Walcheren Island. It was a highly fortified position with the shorelines covered by heavy guns, and the only approach by land was a causeway 12 kilometers long, yet only 40 meters wide. That thin strip of land would cost many Canadians their lives.
Well, the causeway was a beautiful, long, straight road right across to the island, and was just like a shooting gallery. The Germans had an 88 lined up at the far end and a couple of smaller anti-aircraft guns, and they could fire straight down that causeway and ricochet them right off the roadway. While we were trying to get onto the causeway, we took a lot of casualties. We got pinned down, and then the Maisonneuve come up, and it was the Maisies that come up on the south side, and they drove through, and they got pretty well all the way across, and then got stopped at the far end. But in the meantime, British forces and our 3rd Division were coming in by sea from across from Belgium. And it was through the RAF and the landing of the British troops in our 3rd Division on the South Shore that actually took the island.
The Air Force bombed the dikes on Walcheren Island to flood the German positions. Then waterborne troops landed and attacked the isolated defenders. The German defenses collapsed, and the Battle of the Scheldt was over. It had been a very wet and uncomfortable month of fighting, with 6,367 Canadian casualties. It was a Canadian victory, key to the success of the war, and a feat for the nation to be proud of.
When they did get the Scheldt open, the first ship up the Scheldt was a Canadian that docked in Antwerp, And somebody from Holland and somebody from Belgium turned around to our commanders and asked whether there's no Canadians represented there.
We had effected the operation of the port, but nobody got invited to the party.
After the Battle of the Scheldt, the Canadian troops moved north to man the front lines for the winter. The British and Americans moved south to engage the Germans in Belgium and France. The war came to a standstill as both sides dug in along the Maas River. For the Canadians, it was a chance to reinforce the units and to replace those who had been killed or wounded. The Canadian front stretched from Dunkirk on the coast all the way to the Nijmegen salient on the German frontier.
But after the Scheldt, we moved up into around Nijmegen. By that time, winter was setting in.
We moved on up to Nijmegen to take over from the 82nd Airborne, U.S. Airborne, who had taken the Nijmegen Bridge.
They called it at the time the Watch on the Maas. Nothing much happened.
You can't do a devil of a lot because there was a lot of wetlands near the area.
At one stage that they thought that we might be overrun, and we had to phone back every hour on the hour every night to say that we were still there. And somehow or other I got they wanted the same person to phone back each hour to make sure that, you know, some English-speaking German hadn't taken over our position. And, you know, for 6 or 7 weeks up there, I never slept more than about 40 minutes at a time.
If you had good binoculars, you could see across the valley about 500 yards. You can see some of the positions.
There was a chicken coop in the back end of our place. The door was on their side. We'd hear the Germans coming in to occupy the slit trench on their side. And then you'd hear the door of the chicken coop open. And the great commotion in the chicken coop. And we'd be on, get out of that chicken coop. Leave those eggs alone. All kinds of silly stuff. And they just laughed.
We were issued no antifreeze. In that cold part of the winter, we had to get up, or, you know, the drivers had to start the tanks and the self-propelled vehicles, my impression, every hour, and run them for 5 or 10 minutes just to keep them from freezing.
At night, there would be a Jeep come up and bring a hot meal. And they would come up, and that Jeep come up a back road, a gravel road. Of course, it was all gravel, and come up and into our position, and with these big canisters of food, and the Germans never fired on it. And their food, their hot meal, come up on a three-wheel cart with a horse, and the man on the drive sitting up on it, and no one ever fired on him. It was an unwritten rule. You don't touch the man with the food.
At the time, you know, it was kind of a frightening thing. You know, you didn't dare move around except at night.
Nijmegen, we were given the job under the bridge down in the flats. Because the Germans, they didn't get to blow the bridge up, but they continually tried to. They got ropes on both sides of the bridge. And Harry and myself, they put us on this, and I thought I was going on a raft. I was up at the cottage, and pulled us out in the middle of the river, the Wall River, and tied it off both sides. And we just sat there all night. Everything was coming down the river. Didn't matter if it was a duck or a cigarette package. We just sat there popping all night. We don't know what we ever hit. But I mean, they never did blow that bridge.
We patrolled the dikes. We didn't do too much in the daytime.
Well, you try to find a place where, if there's an old house nearby that had a cellar in it, you'd use that to do your rest in, and the rest of the time you'd be in your trenches.
When we got home, I used to call it home, the mother would make us a cup of tea with rose petals because the Germans had taken all their tea and everything else away from them.
This Dutch family, they had 3 children, very young ones. I walked into the kitchen, I handed the lady a the house a hot loaf of bread. She broke down and cried. And the kids gathered around her. They didn't know what it was. White bread.
They were wonderful. They'd give you anything.
And we see what happened to the civilians, what the German army did to Holland. That's when it hit home.
With the war coming to a standstill in the winter, the Canadian soldiers were able to enjoy some of the Dutch hospitality and to start to develop bonds of friendship with the locals. There was time for R&R, but the war was never far away. The Canadians needed to be diligent in case of an attack at any time and to seek out intelligence at every opportunity.
In the winter of 44, 45, when the line becomes static, we did foot patrols.
The intelligence officer would call you in and show you an aerial photograph or a map and point out certain areas that they wanted more information on. And you went out and did the patrol?
We did a lot of patrolling during that period, locating enemy positions and sort of getting an intelligence of where everything was.
Leave where we were at night, go to the dike, over the dike, across the marshy land, we'd get in behind their lines. And if we could, we'd pick up a prisoner, pick up two, bring them back. And on the other end, there's another type of patrol. It's called a fighting patrol. You 10 men, 12 men, you get out, you get into their lines, raise hell, shoot up everything, grab a couple of prisoners, then get back if you're lucky.
And Jim Wilkinson, we're coming back. And the password was steamer trunk. The man who challenged you was in a slit trench or a dugout. He's always got his rifle, but he may often have a Sten gun or a Bren. And when he hollers, halt, steamer, you better remember the rest of that password. And Hook says, luggage, baggage. Wait a minute, wait. And I'm standing there and I said, Jesus Christ, Jim, you better get it right, quick. And he said, hold on, it's scout platoon. Hold on a minute, I remember the darn thing. The guy says, I'll give you one more chance. I'll give you one more chance. Steamer. Jim says, oh God, trunk. The young lad says, don't pull that on me again. The patrol might have been sort of boring, but the greetings weren't.
Christmas far away from home was never easy. But in 1944, the holiday took on a new meaning for many Canadian soldiers.
Before Christmas, there was a dike over in their area, and they come out and sat on that dike and sang Christmas carols in German and in English. And it was fantastic.
Just before Christmas, our mail caught up to us. And we were getting food parcels, Christmas cakes, so forth and so on. Everybody turned their food over to a guy called Santa Claus. They had all the local children in a town hall, and he'd come in, Chris Krinkle, distributed whatever we had.
We put a party on for these Dutch children. In hindsight, that was kind of impressive. You know, we had our rations, but that didn't go very far. But what was interesting is that almost everybody seemed to have something in their packs sent over from home, and these kind of care packages we had, and we would donate all of these things to the party. And gee, the eyes of these little children, when you think about it, they're not very exciting type of food, but to them it was something that was unbelievable to these little Dutch children, and it really made their day. I think now, have I ever made anybody happier than those children?
During that frigid winter, the Germans launched a surprise attack in the Ardennes forest in Belgium. It would be their last major offensive of the war, and it was a desperate attack to break through the American lines in order to recapture Antwerp. If successful, it would have crippled the Allies and pushed them back into France. It would be known as the Battle of the Bulge.
We started to celebrate that Christmas, and then the orders came to move south to Antwerp. It was the time of the Ardennes forest.
We were called into the Ardennes to fight in the Battle of the Bulge.
What was feared is that the Americans might have broken completely, and the Germans, of course, were trying to take Antwerp.
We fought our way in. It was not too difficult, but it was cold because the freezing temperatures were extreme, an unusual winter, and the hobnailed boots brought in the frost into the feet since we had the same uniforms as we did in Normandy. And the result is that we had more casualties from frost than we did from fighting.
Nothing happened. You know, the Americans held, and then we moved back up to the Moss and waited for the spring.
And then we were rerouted to go to Holland to relieve another division who had been in the line for some time. In that travel from the Ardennes, most of the battalion was hit with dysentery, and I wasn't. I don't know, for some reason or other, but it was funny. Every time the truck stopped for a break on the hour, everybody would pile out down their trousers on the side of the road.
At the same time as the Ardennes offensive, the Germans launched an attack over the Maas at Kapellschweer. It turned into a fierce month-long battle that no one would be able to forget. It was waged in miserable conditions, with heavy casualties suffered on both sides. The Canadians prevailed, and the watch on the Maas continued. As the winter dragged on, the Canadians were anxiously waiting for spring and the offensive that was sure to be launched.